Hello and welcome to West Indies on 99.94 Cricket Every Day. My name is Mashal St. Patrick Hewitt, one half of the Caribbean Cricket Podcast, and with me as ever is my co-host Santoki Nagulendran, the other half of the Caribbean Cricket Podcast. West Indies on 99.94 is your new home for West Indies cricket content, and we'll be dropping into your podcast feeds on YouTube or on the 99.94 app several times every week. So rate, review, like, subscribe, share. And if you've got a chance, check out the Mitch Johnson Show, where the former Aussie Quick talks about his life and cricket. You can find it where you listen to podcasts or on YouTube. But more importantly of all, thanks for joining Cricket's Conversation. Today on West Indies on 99.94, we're going to be talking about Phil Simmons' resignation. Santoki, take it away.
I feel like we say this every week, Mashal, but there is never a dull day in West Indies cricket. And so today we're here to talk about head coach Phil Simmons, who's resigned from his position just over 3 years into his second stint as West Indies head coach. It shouldn't be too much of a surprise to people after the nature of our World Cup exit. So let's just get straight into it. I'll read out the statement which Cricket West Indies put out regarding Phil Simmons stepping down. So Phil Simmons, in his own words, said, "I acknowledge that it's not just the team that is hurting, but the proud nations we represent as well. It's disappointing and heart-wrenching, but we just didn't turn up. We weren't good enough, and we now have to watch a tournament play out without our involvement. And for that, I deeply apologise to our fans and followers. From a personal perspective, this is not a knee-jerk reaction, but a move I've been considering for some time, and now is the time to make public that I will step down as West Indies head coach at the end of the Test series against Australia. It is earlier than hoped for, but I will now focus my energies into Australia on continuing to build the excellent progress the Test team has made. Of course, as the President has pointed out, we will also carry out the necessary review into our World Cup campaign." Now, Mashal, just kind of deducing from what he said in that statement, we know his contract run was due to run out 2023 after the ODI World Cup. You can imagine he was planning on staying for that duration, but the nature of losing in the qualifiers for the World Cup in the T20 format has essentially forced his hand, would you say?
Yeah, and I think what's come to pass is basically what we foreshadowed a few months back, possibly even longer than a few months back. We always felt that following the poor World Cup performance in 2021, that Phil was unlikely to be able to outlive another poor World Cup performance, irrespective of the fact that his contract went to 2023 and potentially a 50-over World Cup. I think the bigger question for me is, has Phil jumped before he was pushed? We said in episode 26 that somebody was always going to have to be held accountable. Whether people like it or not, there has to be a quote-unquote scapegoat. Phil going now ahead of time, ahead of the review that's going to be carried out by the necessary stakeholders at Cricket West Indies means that essentially they can already say, well, the person who we hold responsible has already now left. So it minimizes the amount of kind of superficial changes that now need to take place. Because you and I have spoken at length that regardless of whether people think this is the right decision, wrong decision, etc., there are far deeper and more important structural changes. And Phil's alluded to it himself. That need to take place that will never be fixed by replacing Phil with a new guy.
Yeah, and I think in his last press conference after we lost to Ireland, where he said the batsmen were unprofessional, you can read into that now in hindsight as him essentially saying the job was enough for him. The players weren't listening to him. There was sort of there were issues, as you said, systematically within the West Indies, and I think maybe it's just exhaustion. If we remember as well, he's had to coach during the unprecedented period of COVID, so being in bubbles for long periods over the past 2 years. There's been unforgiving cuss-outs from the region stakeholders, which has been going on and on. And so you imagine it's all sort of just come to a head and kind of culminated in this disastrous World Cup campaign, which is following on from the disastrous one in 2021. And so when all the ingredients have been added together, it's entirely predictable that he probably thought it'd be easier for himself to just sort of step away from this high-pressure role.
Yeah, they're similar. I think we have to equate it to Pollard. Right? We thought Pollard was going to kind of drag it out until the end of the 2022 World Cup, and he stepped away prior to the 6 months prior to that World Cup because he'd had enough. He'd had enough of the relentless cuss-outs from elements of the media, fan base, just always seeking to almost project everything through Kieran Pollard. Pollard's gone now, and before Pollard, everything was projected through Roger Harper as selector. Now everything's projected through Phil Simmons as head coach. So he's now gone. So really, for me, Santoki, the next question is, who's the next person to project everything through? Obviously, Pooran's catching some heat right now. Ricky Skerritt, as Cricket West Indies president, is likely to catch some heat. And do you know what? You're starting to work me up a bit now, because I said before we press record, I was like, let me try. In my head, I was like, I'm going to be calm today, but you're working me up, because as a fan base, we are our own worst enemy. All the while, we continue to feel that we can explain away problems in West Indies cricket by focusing on one person here, one person there. We're no closer. We're not 1 inch closer to turning over what is now a 20-year stretch of mass underachievement. I'm not saying that to say that we're defending Phil and saying Phil shouldn't have quit. Phil had to go. I think that's fair. Phil had to go, and Phil's recognised that himself. But our culture of our blame culture in the Caribbean is not helping us.
Yeah, exactly. And it'd be interesting because he obviously emphasised as well in his leaving statement that the test side have been doing positively over the past 2 years, which you can't really disagree with. I think our test format essentially at the moment is probably the strongest. New players have come in, Carl Mayers, Josh De Silva, who have really taken to the longer format. Michelle, are you disappointed that Phil Simmons has stepped down overall? Would you have liked to have seen him retained in a red ball capacity? Or do you just think the financial hardships of Cricket West Indies mean they can essentially only have one coach for multi-formats at the moment?
Well, this is a very interesting issue you raise here, Santoki. So this is how you know that this was wholly Phil's decision first and foremost, because any rational West Indian fan should be thinking, well, there's no need to get rid of Phil in the Test format, where we're fifth in the World Test Championship, unprecedented heady times. Now, we're probably not going to end fifth because we're due to take licks against Australia and South Africa before it all ends, right? But we're fifth at this moment in time. We've beaten the higher-ranked England, we drew with the higher-ranked Pakistan, and we licked down Bangladesh home and away, right? So, test-wise, we're cool. I would have had no issue with Skerritt and Cole doing their review and assessing by January 2023, you know what, Phil, it's just not working in white ball, but we respect what you've done for our Test cricket. We want you to carry on. But clearly, Phil has taken that aspect of the decision out of their hands. And I also have to admonish the fans and the media who have been so narrow-minded in their thought process. The amount of people or things that I've read where it's like, Phil should go now. What's he still hanging on for to go to Australia? As if we've not been doing well in Test cricket. Like, where's the nuance? This is why we got some dunderheads in Caribbean media and Caribbean fan base. Fine, cool. We can understand that Phil's not done well in white ball cricket, but look at the nuance. It's not Phil's not done well, full stop. There's a nuance to this particular take. So I'm not quite understanding why people are saying let him go now, as the man's already in Australia. So what do they want to happen then for Australia? They want Phil to go 2 weeks before all the players are due to land in Australia and start their preparation and tour games, etc. If they want Phil, so who's supposed to coach the team in Australia then? Nobody. Like, I don't understand. Johnny Grave was on was on Sportsmax, I think a couple of days ago or yesterday, and he said that Phil was operating within the tenets of his contract. He has to give 12 weeks notice. So I think we also have to look at it from a contractual situation. Phil can't just up and go and say, well, I quit, bye, sort Australia out yourself. He's given his 12-week notice period, so he'll work his notice, and that includes Australia, and that's fine with me.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's a fitting finale for Phil to kind of lead the Test side in Australia. Obviously, as you said, we're due to take licks, but if anyone can try and prevent the amount of licks we take, it's Phil Simmons in the Test coach role. But Mash, we're going to take a quick break, and afterwards, I think we'll look at the highs and lows of Phil Simmons' reign as West Indies coach.
You're listening to Cricket's Conversation on 99.94. Whatever your team, we have the show for you on podcast, YouTube, or on the 99.94 app. We have India, England, South Africa, West Indies, and now Sri Lanka covered. If you want to find us, the best way is to follow us on social media at 9994DM by downloading the 9994 app or Google 99.94 on podcast. We speak cricket.
Okay, we're back now. Masha, we've talked about sort of how Phil Simmons has done well in the red ball arena. In the white ball, it just hasn't worked out since he's taken over in 2019. Now, just looking at it, would you say this was essentially a coaching weakness? Do you think kind of the white ball game had moved beyond his kind of capabilities? Or do you just think it was the quality of players he was working with, or a combination of factors?
Good question. I think it's got to be a combination of factors. As much as people want to probably try and look for one kind of catch-all explanation, it's never that simple. It's never, ever. And that's life. Anything that goes wrong in life is never just one factor. So again, it's too simplistic to go, well, it's just Phil. I think fundamentally, if I had to narrow it down, I think, yes, over the course of time, you would have to say that as head coach, Phil must take responsibility, obviously his backroom staff as well, that they weren't able to overturn our deficiencies in the T20, but I would say white ball formats. However, there are a unique, and I want your take on this, Santoki, there are a unique set of circumstances that seemingly only afflict West Indies cricket more than anybody else, right? We are the only Test, quote unquote, nation who consistently isn't able to put their best team on the pitch at any one moment in time, or the best set of players on the pitch at any one moment in time. There's always someone missing. There's always a madness going on. There's always a beef going down. There's always a story in the newspaper. So that's factor number one for me. We are afflicted more than anybody else. Even for this World Cup, no Hetmeyer, no Narine, just to name two. Right? Evan Lewis got in having not played for the whole year, just to name a third, right? So we have that issue. Two, and we've alluded to it on previous episodes, and it is a factor. I don't think it's a cop-out to say that we have not coped with the transition well enough. We did not plot our transition well enough from one generation to the next generation of players. The hope for me, Santoki, is that this set of players who've gone to the 2022 World Cup might be better 2 years from now when we go to the 2024 World Cup after 2 more years of trying to gel as a team, irrespective of who's a coach. I mean, it's a long shot, but they might be. But we didn't cope with the transition well. And then the third factor of the many factors we could point to then goes back to that's when you then look at, was the coaching maximizing the ability of these players? And actually, I'll throw in a fourth, are these players actually good enough right now at this specific moment in time? So it's a myriad of factors for me, Santoki.
Yeah, I think you raise a very, very valid point, Mash. I think when Phil Simmons was in charge in 2016, when we won the World Cup, even then, we were missing Sunil Narine and Kyron Pollard, but we had enough depth and quality in the likes of, say, no Sunil Narine, but we could call on Samuel Badri and Suleiman Ben. We had that depth. Obviously, moving forward a few years, we don't have that depth. So when we are missing players like a Shimron Hetmeyer and a Sunil Narine, it massively impacts this inexperienced side. So I think you're right. I think it was a unique set of circumstances in West Indian cricket where we're the only side in the world who are consistently always missing. I mean, when was the last time we've essentially been able to put out the best available 11 players we have in the West Indies? It's almost unprecedented. We're always missing 1 or 2 players, and no other side really needs to have to work in these conditions. I think, as you said, that there can obviously be calls for the actual coaching, kind of what has been done to develop the white ball game in the region with the players we have, because we see a consistent thread throughout the team of reckless shots and an inability to kind of rotate strike. Why have these things not been addressed? So that thing Phil Simmons and Monty Desai can be held accountable for, I guess. But then, as you also said, is it just a case of the quality isn't there? I know in global cricket, fans are always trying to push the agenda that it's West Indies. These are the next West Indian stars who can sort of replicate the Chris Gales, Kyron Pollard, DJ Bravos. Maybe we just haven't got the talent, as we've rightly said. Maybe it was just a golden generation. This is what we're working with. And Phil Simmons did as best as he can. To be honest, we'll only know in terms of the white ball game, in terms of hindsight, when the new coach comes in and we can compare kind of how the new coach reacts to these players and how they perform under him. So for the moment, it's hard to gauge if Phil Simmons kind of his success as a white ball coach is something we need to compare, I'd imagine. But my gut feeling is the quality of players and just isn't there, and we've got high expectations in the region because of the precedent. So whoever takes over, I find it hard to believe we'll see a dramatic or drastic improvement within the next year or so. It's going to be a lot of struggles, and it wouldn't surprise me if we performed just as badly in the 2024 World Cup, because it's only 2 years away. I don't know how you can change the sort of widespread issues within the team and the region. The only thing that can help us in 2024 is we'll have the home support, which might galvanize a lot of players.
You say galvanize, that might hinder them even more so. I mean, if they lose, you think the cuss out, that we're used to is long. Watch a cuss out if we actually lose games in certain territories when it's a home tournament. That live cuss out in the stand, boy, I don't know. But there was a point that you raised there, Santoki, about the quality and a new coach, etc., etc. I just want to clarify for people, we're not saying, because I think sometimes when we say this, people think we're saying that these players aren't talented. The raw talent is there. So Dean Smith, his raw talent, we can't question that. The guy can bowl 140 plus clicks. He can launch balls out of the ground. The raw talent is there. What we question when we say the quality is, it's all good and well having that raw talent, but if you are unable to show any level of consistency with that talent, then I'm saying that the quality is not there. The talent is there, but quality to me means consistency and ability to show it on a consistent level. And right now, out of our 11 or 15 man squad that went to that particular World Cup, and even if you look at our ODI team, how many players, I can think of one or two off the top of my head, can honestly say, so Alzari Joseph, consistent, right? Akil Hussain, consistent. Shea Hope, consistent if we look at ODI cricket. But how many, that's 3, right? I dare anybody listening to this now to name 5 players who you can say consistently are good in West Indies white ball, right? Consistently good. You know they're likely to produce more often than not. And no team, Santoki, can compete when I'm struggling to name more than 3. So what are we expecting from the other 8 players on the team then? so that's kind of what I'm talking about. But do you know what, Santoki? Let's take another quick break, because we alluded to it, but we haven't touched on it yet. Because let's look at the positives of Phil Simmons' reign. And also, I think we should probably consider who might be next after to replace Phil.
If you love the language of cricket and want more, then head over to the 99.94 app and you can hear all of our podcasts and cricket commentary. We're adding new shows all the time and covering cricket series from all over the world. Be the first to hear all of our announcements by following us on social media at 9994DM. Welcome to Cricket's Conversation.
So, Santoki, we wanted to talk about positives. And I'm just going to read some stats out to you, right? These are the last 10 West Indies head coaches in terms of full-time appointments, not interim. Roger Harper, 2000 to 2003, win percentage 39%. Gus Logie, 2003 to 2004, 37%, and the Champions Trophy was won in 2004. Bennett King, 2004 to 2007, 30%. John Dyson, 2007 to 2009, 29%. Otis Gibson, 2010 to 2014, 38%, and also the 2012 T20 World Cup. Phil Simmons, 2015 to 2016, 32%, but the 2016 T20 World Cup was one as well. Stuart Law, 2017 to 2018, 34%. Richard Pybus, 2019, 36%. Phil Simmons, 2019 to 2022, 36%. That is the win percentage of all the full-time head coaches we've had in the last 20 plus years, Santoki. They've all fallen somewhere between 29% to 39%. And that 39% was 20 years ago, right? What do you make of that, Santoki?
I think it obviously indicates a wider systematic issue. If you've got a range of essentially coaches for the last 20 years falling within a 10% win radius, it obviously points to wider issues because those coaches there all have variant talents, variant skills. So it obviously isn't an issue with individual coaches, because if it was down purely to individual coaching, you'd have an anomaly and someone would have got over a 50% win percentage, for example. The fact that it's all within the same radius means there's obviously a systematic issue within the region. So I think Phil Simmons did as well as you can expect. There's an argument that he didn't overperform, but there's also an argument he didn't underperform. He performed as you would expect within the means and environment of West Indies cricket, within the context of that list that you've given us, Mash.
Yeah, and what's interesting is that some will say that I'm making excuses for Phil if I did it. But if you pull the data of Phil's record prior to COVID or the beginning of COVID and then all the bio bubbles and out of it, there's quite a bit of varied data in there. And I'm willing to give, if people at us at Carib Cricket, I'm willing to give them that data. But I said before the break, let's focus on the positives. And at the end of the day, Santoki, Phil will go down in history in being, this guy coached us through COVID, basically, right? No fans, back-to-back white ball, red ball. When he came on the Caribbean Cricket Podcast, I think that was one of the rare moments in his whole stint where he actually had a break and was with his family, I think in the UK at the time, right? But this guy's basically been traveling non-stop for 2 years in bio bubbles, right? I'm not saying that's an excuse, but I am saying it's a unique set of circumstances. Something else that people don't seem to have alluded to as well, post and pre his resignation, is in that 2 year period, Santoki, we had no domestic cricket. Let me repeat that again. We had a 2021 Super 50. We had a 5-round 4-day championship, which only just happened this year. So between 2020 and 2022, he was basically going on no stats, nothing, because unlike the rest of the world, which exited the pandemic much earlier, the Caribbean was basically shut down completely for 2 years with no sport taking place until basically March this year is when it really properly returned. And again, I'm not trying to absolve Phil of blame, but I do think, Santoki, that if we're going to do an appropriate assessment of Phil and his reign, I do think people have to acknowledge that is a pretty unique set of circumstances. If you're willing to shout at him and go, Phil was no good, I think you have to take into consideration that his players didn't play any domestic cricket for 2 years, and then we were telling him why can't they play better? Or do you think I'm giving him too much slack there, Santoki?
No, I think that's accurate. It was an unprecedented period of coaching. He essentially had to, as you said, rightly coach during unprecedented times. And for instance, we were the first ever team to do an international cricket tour during the COVID pandemic when we came to England in 2020. He's had to lead through all of that. At some points, it's felt as if he's essentially just had to make sure a team was able to go out on the field and play to fulfill obligations rather than getting the best out of it. A case in example being the Bangladesh away tour in 2021, when we went with an obliterated squad just to fulfill the tour obligations, and he eventually pulled out a miraculous win. So he's had his hands tied behind his back throughout the majority of his reign, and whoever comes in afterwards will be privileged enough to not have to work in these circumstances of being in COVID bubbles, no domestic cricket. So they'll already have a higher platform than Phil Simmons has had for the majority of his reign since 2019. So I think you definitely need to have context there and think that he's guided us through an uncertain period, and especially in Test cricket, giving us a platform where we can go even higher with a settled squad, young players coming into it. So I think that will be his legacy more so in the red ball cricket, and also the highlights he's given us in the format. That win I mentioned in Bangladesh, the home series win against England, all momentous occasions in the Caribbean, and providing highlights, probably some of the best highlights for West Indies cricket fans of the last 20 years, those two wins. So he has had a legacy in red ball cricket. Unfortunately, it hasn't worked out in white ball cricket. But as I think you rightly said, it was unprecedented times for him. No other coach in West Indies will have to go through this, hopefully, ever again, leading through a pandemic. So we have to bear in mind that context when judging his performance as a coach.
Yeah, and I think just coming off the back of what you said there, it's worth noting that in this last 2 years, Phil has been the coach whilst Josh De Silva has established himself on the international scene. Carl Mayers wasn't known to anybody really and truly until coming under Phil's tutelage in the Test arena. Nkrumah Bonner is come under Phil's tutelage in the Test arena. Jaden Seals has come into the Test arena under Phil's tutelage. So if we're gonna be critical about the white ball, we have to also look on the flip side with the red ball and say, well, you know what, certain players owe their advancement and establishment in certainly in the red ball cricket down to Phil Simmons and what he's managed to do with them. And actually, I should also state again, I should have mentioned this earlier on, but it's just come into my head. One of the reasons why Phil has also stayed on for Australia is, as I understand it, Craig Brathwaite was spoken to as West Indies Test coach as to his views on it, and he gave a full endorsement of Phil's leadership of the Test side and said he felt it was better for Phil to stay around for the Test series than go to that series against Australia with some interim head coach and so on and so forth. So this notion, as that fans can have and media can have, that the players aren't appreciative of Phil, I think they definitely need to revisit that, because there was certainly an endorsement from Craig. Now listen, Santoki, before we wrap up, let's just quickly answer this question. Who's next, Santoki? Who's next into the poison? Who's next to take up the poison chalice? Who's next to get the cuss out of a lifetime from West Indies fans and West Indies media when they also struggle in the role? Who do we turn to, Santoki? Ricky Skerritt says it's supposed to be West Indian first. So ideally, we're supposed to look at potential West Indian appointments, but I don't think Skerritt should overlook any potential overseas appointment if there's a good enough person available. What would... It's think of it like a Football Manager save, Santoki. Think of it like that. Because West Indies on Football Manager is a classic save. If West Indies was on Football Manager, everybody would manage them because they'd be like, it's a challenge. Take over a fallen giant. They used to be great back in the 80s. Let's try and revitalize them. So maybe the name of West Indies still potentially carries some kind of weight to some of the top coaches in the world.
Yeah, well, I think there's only really one obvious name. We've mentioned him on a few podcasts. Obviously, there was no Guyanese contingent at the T20 World Cup, but I think it probably will be a Guyanese head coach we have next in Shivnarine Chanderpaul. I think the win with the Talawars in CPL has highlighted his T20 credentials. I think before that, he probably would have got the red ball job at least, based on the fact that he is Shivnarine Chanderpaul. He's got his coaching badges, his credentials there. So I think all the factors have added up. And at the moment, his stock is probably as high as it can be with that CPL win. So I think Cricket West Indies, it would be foolish not to at least approach Shivnarine Chanderpaul to see if they can get him in as head coach or in some capacity. But for me, he's the obvious name. If you are going for one coach to manage all three formats, Chanderpaul's shown that he can do it across all three. So I think Chanderpaul would be an obvious example. If it wasn't to go to Chanderpaul and you were sticking to this West Indian policy, I don't know who would be an obvious candidate, bearing in mind it's multi-format. Obviously, yes, in the T20 cricket format, we could say Darren Sammy would be a perfect candidate as a head coach, knowing what he's done as a captain and a leader. But how would he fare in Test cricket? So it depends on the context of, if it's a one job for all formats, I think it's obviously Chanderpaul. If they're going to separate the formats, we could see some interesting faces come in. But I think definitely we probably will be seeing Chanderpaul in the new year as West Indies head coach.
One name that I'm willing to throw out there, Santoki, and that's only because we've had him on the podcast, is Donovan Miller, right? And the reason I'm going to throw Donovan's name out there, again, here's the issue. you've already kind of raised it by saying how well known does it have to be a well-known name to appease a lot of the media and a lot of the fan base, a lot of the bigger territories, etc. But Donovan Miller's level 4 trained, right? Has all the qualifications you need within the ECB, etc. I don't know if Cricket West Indies would sound him out, but the reason I'm saying his name is because if they went down a split role route, then I think he's somebody to definitely to consider. I think your point is valid that if they're going to go down the route of one man coach everything, then possibly Donovan's not going to get into the conversation. But if they decide, you know what, it's now time to split the roles, a specific white ball coach and a specific red ball coach, then I think we should probably consider somebody like a Donovan Miller as well.
Yeah, and I think Chanderpaul has the rare ability in the region to, well, up until now, to sort of avoid ever getting cussed out because of the name Chanderpaul and people's admiration for him. So I think he would ideally be someone who could think he could get on with in the task of head coach without avoiding a massive cuss out. But yeah, it'd be interesting to see kind of how it goes. But my initial reaction would be Chanderpaul. I'd love to see someone like a Donovan Miller get a chance in the T20 format, but it just depends on the context of it all. Of course, the finances that Cricket West Indies are working in terms of what salary they can offer if they're looking for a foreign coach. But it will be very interesting to kind of see the short list of names who kind of get through and who they eventually go for.
Most definitely. Well, you know what, people, as ever, we always say, whenever you listen to West Indies on 99.94, send us any comments you've got. You can find us at Carib Cricket, Twitter, Instagram, Caribbean Cricket Podcast on Facebook. Myself and Santoki, obviously, we have our own individual ats as well. So if there's anything you agree with, disagree with, hit us up. But Santoki, it's goodbye from me. Is it goodbye from you?
Yep, it's a goodbye from me, and we'll see you on the other side, guys.